Welcome to episode 2 of our Armageddon World War II series. In this episode, we will discuss the Blitzkrieg across Europe. Thank you so much for stopping by today. The term Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war in German, described a new method of warfare developed and perfected by Nazi Germany. It relied on rapid movement, overwhelming force, and precise coordination between ground and air units. German generals believed that speed and shock were the keys to victory. Instead of the slow, grinding trench warfare of the First World War, Blitzkrieg aimed to paralyze the enemy before they could mount a defense. After the fall of Poland, Germany turned its attention to Western Europe. Adolf Hitler wanted to secure Germany's western borders and defeat France quickly. He also aimed to knock Britain out of the war before it could become a serious threat. The German military command developed a new plan for invasion, abandoning the old idea of a direct attack through central Belgium and choosing a bold alternative that would catch the Allies off guard. The invasion of France and the Low Countries began on May 10, 1940. German forces launched simultaneous attacks on Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines to capture key bridges and disrupt communication. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields and railways to cripple Allied mobility. The rapid and unexpected nature of the attack stunned the defenders and created widespread confusion. As expected, Allied forces moved north into Belgium to meet the German advance. What they did not realize was that this move played directly into Germany's hands. While the Allies were occupied in the north, the main German thrust came through the Ardennes forest, a region that was considered too difficult for tanks to cross. The German panzer divisions moved quickly through the forest and broke through the French defensive line at Sedan. Once the Germans had crossed the Meuse River and broken through at Sedan, they pushed rapidly westward toward the English Channel. Their goal was to encircle the bulk of the Allied armies and trap them in northern France. The French and British forces, still focused on the northern front, were caught by surprise. The German advance was so fast that communication between Allied units began to collapse. Within days, German forces had reached the coast, cutting off British and French units in Belgium and northern France from the rest of the country. The Allied armies were surrounded, and their only escape route was the sea. In response, Britain launched Operation Dynamo, a massive evacuation effort aimed at rescuing as many soldiers as possible from the beaches of Dunkirk. From May 26 to June 4, over 300,000 Allied troops were evacuated from Dunkirk under constant threat from German air and ground attacks. The operation was carried out using a fleet of military and civilian vessels. Fishing boats, yachts, and merchant ships crossed the English Channel repeatedly, risking destruction to save the trapped soldiers. Although the evacuation was a success, it left behind huge amounts of equipment and thousands of prisoners. Despite the escape at Dunkirk, the fall of France was now inevitable. German forces continued to push southward, capturing key cities and destroying any remaining resistance. The French government collapsed, and on June 14th, German troops marched into Paris without a fight. The sight of Nazi flags flying over the Eiffel Tower marked a symbolic and strategic victory for Hitler. On June 22nd, France formally surrendered to Germany. The terms of the armistice were harsh. The northern and western parts of France were placed under direct German occupation, while a puppet government was established in the city of Vichy to control the south. The Vichy regime, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, cooperated with the Nazis and implemented anti-Jewish laws and policies. With France defeated, Britain stood alone as the only major European power still resisting Hitler. Many expected Britain to seek peace, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to back down. In a series of powerful speeches, he declared that Britain would never surrender. His leadership rallied the nation and prepared the people for the coming storm. Hitler's next move was to subdue Britain through a combination of air attacks and political pressure. He hoped that a prolonged bombing campaign would destroy British morale and force the government to negotiate. To achieve this, he ordered the Luftwaffe to begin a series of raids targeting British airfields, radar stations, and industrial centres. This marked the beginning of the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain began in July of 1940 and was the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. The German strategy was to gain control of the skies in preparation for a possible invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. The Royal Air Force, although outnumbered, used radar technology, home defense advantages, and highly trained pilots to mount a fierce resistance. During the early stages of the battle, the Luftwaffe focused on attacking military targets. However, after a British bombing raid on Berlin, Hitler changed tactics and ordered attacks on civilian targets instead. German bombers began nightly raids on London and other major cities. These raids, known as the Blitz, caused widespread destruction and killed thousands of civilians. Despite the devastation, British morale did not collapse. Civilians sought shelter in underground stations and basements, emerging each morning to clear rubble and continue daily life. The Royal Air Force inflicted heavy losses on German aircraft, and by October it was clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The failure to defeat Britain marked Hitler's first major setback of the war. It forced Germany to reconsider its strategy and turn attention elsewhere. In the meantime, the Axis powers strengthened their positions in other parts of Europe. Germany signed formal military alliances with Italy and Japan, creating a united front against the Allies. In occupied France, resistance movements began to form. Although fragmented at first, these groups carried out acts of sabotage, gathered intelligence, and helped Allied pilots escape capture. The German occupation forces responded with brutal reprisals, executing hostages and deporting suspected sympathizers. The French resistance would grow stronger in the years ahead and play a vital role in the eventual liberation of the country. In the Balkans, Germany began to expand its influence. Italy, eager to demonstrate its strength, launched an invasion of Greece from Albania in October of 1940. However, the Italian army was poorly prepared and met fierce resistance. Greece pushed the invaders back and even occupied parts of Albania. Hitler, concerned about British involvement in the region, decided to intervene directly. In early 1941, Germany invaded both Yugoslavia and Greece. The campaigns were swift and brutal. German paratroopers captured key positions, and the Luftwaffe bombed cities into submission. By the end of April, both countries had fallen, and German troops occupied strategic positions across the Balkans. These operations delayed the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, but secured Germany's southern flank. With Western Europe under occupation and Southern Europe brought under control, Hitler turned his gaze eastward. He viewed the Soviet Union as the ultimate enemy and believed that conquering its vast territory would provide Germany with the resources needed for long-term dominance. The groundwork was being laid for the largest military invasion in history. In Norway, after Germany's rapid conquest in April of 1940, the Nazis installed a puppet government under Vidkun Quisling, a Norwegian fascist who collaborated closely with Hitler. The name Quisling would become synonymous with betrayal across Europe. Norway's ports and airfields became valuable assets for the German war effort, especially for controlling shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. British forces had attempted to defend Norway, but logistical challenges and strong German resistance forced a withdrawal, giving Germany full control over the region. While Germany solidified its hold on Western Europe, neutral nations scrambled to maintain their sovereignty. Countries like Sweden and Switzerland maintained a delicate balance by offering limited cooperation while avoiding direct involvement. Sweden allowed German troop transport through its territory and continued trade in iron ore, while Switzerland remained officially neutral but surrounded by Axis powers. These arrangements allowed them to avoid occupation, but their neutrality was always under threat. Spain, under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, had recently emerged from a brutal civil war and was sympathetic to the Axis cause. However, Franco chose not to enter the war directly. Spain remained a non-belligerent state and provided limited assistance to Germany, including access to ports and intelligence cooperation. Franco's regime used the opportunity to rebuild Spain's economy and military without committing to full-scale conflict. Portugal, led by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, also maintained neutrality throughout the war. Despite this position, Portugal honored its centuries-old alliance with Britain by allowing the Allies to use bases in the Azores. These strategic airfields later became crucial for transatlantic operations and anti-submarine patrols. Portugal's careful diplomacy enabled it to avoid invasion and remain intact during a time of widespread destruction. As the Blitzkrieg campaigns raged across Europe, the German military gained a fearsome reputation for its speed and effectiveness. The success of mechanized warfare inspired military planners around the world to adopt similar tactics. However, the strategy had limitations. Blitzkrieg relied heavily on surprise, coordination, and favorable terrain. It was most effective in regions with developed roads and railways. As the war expanded, the challenges of logistics and extended supply lines would become more apparent. With much of Western Europe under Nazi control by mid-1940, Hitler believed that Britain would eventually come to the negotiating table. However, British resolve only hardened under the leadership of Winston Churchill. The British people prepared for a long struggle, and the government instituted strict rationing, expanded civil defense, and mobilized the population for total war. Every able-bodied citizen contributed to the war effort through factory work, agriculture, and volunteer service. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, continued its campaign in the Atlantic. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys carrying food, weapons, and supplies to Britain. The Battle of the Atlantic became one of the longest and most critical struggles of the war. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked tirelessly to decrypt German naval communications. The success of the Enigma code-breaking effort would later become one of the Allies' greatest secret weapons. In occupied countries, the civilian populations experienced the harsh reality of Nazi rule. In Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, curfews were imposed, rationing was enforced, and local resistance was met with brutal crackdowns. Jewish communities were targeted with discriminatory laws, forced relocations, and eventual deportations to concentration camps. Collaborationist governments emerged in some areas, while underground resistance movements grew in strength and coordination. The Netherlands suffered particularly harsh treatment under German occupation. The Dutch government had fled to London, leaving the people to endure growing repression. Jews in Amsterdam were forced to register and wear identifying stars. These measures laid the groundwork for mass deportations that would come in later years. Despite this, many Dutch citizens risked their lives to hide Jewish families and sabotage German operations. In France, the Vichy regime sought to maintain some level of autonomy by cooperating with German authorities. It enacted its own anti-Semitic laws and handed over Jews and political dissidents to the Gestapo. French citizens were subjected to propaganda campaigns, food shortages, and forced labor conscription. At the same time, resistance groups formed throughout the countryside, creating underground networks that would later support the Allied liberation. The Battle of Britain, which began in the summer of 1940, marked a turning point in the war. It demonstrated that Hitler's forces could be resisted and even repelled. The Royal Air Force's defense of British skies prevented a German invasion and gave the Allies a much-needed psychological victory. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped, and the myth of German invincibility was broken. Hitler's failure to defeat Britain also had long-term strategic consequences. It forced Germany to maintain a significant military presence in Western Europe, diverting troops and resources that might have been used elsewhere. It also strengthened British resolve to seek allies and expand the conflict into a truly global war. Churchill began forging stronger ties with the United States, whose involvement would eventually turn the tide. In Eastern Europe, Germany increased pressure on the Soviet Union. Although the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was still in effect, relations between the two powers were deteriorating. Hitler viewed communism as a mortal enemy and believed that a war against the Soviet Union was inevitable. The vast resources of the Soviet lands tempted the German leadership, and preparations for a massive invasion were already underway. While Hitler planned his eastern offensive, he also focused on securing the Balkans. After Italy's failed invasion of Greece, German forces intervened in April of 1941. Within weeks, Yugoslavia and Greece were overrun by German troops. These campaigns delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union, but ensured that southern Europe was under Axis control. German troops now occupied nearly every country on the European mainland. Resistance to Nazi rule grew steadily in every occupied territory. In Poland, secret schools, newspapers, and military units operated under constant threat of discovery. In France, sabotage operations increased, targeting railways, factories, and German supply lines. In Norway, resistance fighters launched daring raids against German installations. These acts of defiance kept the spirit of freedom alive and prepared the ground for future Allied support. The Blitzkrieg era of rapid conquest had brought much of Europe under Nazi domination in less than 2 years. Hitler's military strategy had proven devastatingly effective, and his territorial gains were vast. Yet each conquest came with new challenges. Occupation required manpower, resources, and administrative control. Resistance, rebellion, and the burden of maintaining order would stretch German forces thin as the war dragged on. In Britain, the civilian population endured nightly bombings, shortages, and the constant fear of invasion. Yet morale remained high, bolstered by Churchill's leadership and a deep sense of purpose. Volunteer organizations such as the Home Guard, air raid precautions units, and fire brigades worked tirelessly to protect cities and maintain public order. Children were evacuated to the countryside, and families adapted to life in a nation at war. The Blitz also failed to break British industry. Factories continued to produce aircraft, weapons, and vehicles, often relocating to safer areas to avoid bomb damage. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, taking over roles traditionally held by men. The British war economy became more efficient and focused, laying the foundation for a sustained fight against the Axis powers. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral, but increasingly supportive of Britain. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March of 1941, allowed the US to supply arms and equipment to countries fighting the Axis powers. American factories ramped up production, and convoys carrying vital materials crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from German submarines. The United States was inching closer to direct involvement. Germany's decision to abandon the air war over Britain and shift its focus eastward was a critical moment. While the Luftwaffe continued to bomb British cities sporadically, the main effort now turned to Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed that a quick victory over the Soviet Union would secure German dominance and eliminate the communist threat. What followed would be the largest and most brutal invasion in history. The world stood on the brink of a far wider and more destructive phase of the conflict. The Axis powers had achieved enormous territorial gains, but cracks were beginning to show. Britain had survived, the Soviet Union was preparing for war, and the United States was no longer a distant observer. Blitzkrieg had worked for now, but the global war was only beginning to reveal its full fury. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. Subscribe if you have not already so you can catch the rest of our 24-part series.